In the heart of Renaissance Florence, where art and beauty blossomed with unparalleled vibrancy, a singular figure emerged, poised to transform paradise into a harrowing purgatory. Girolamo Savonarola was his name, and for 4 years, etched in fear, he governed the jewel of Italy with the unyielding hand of religious zealotry. The very crowds who later clamored for his demise once knelt before him in near-divine reverence. But power rooted in fear and extremism is inherently fragile, and its collapse is inevitably as devastating as its ascent was rapid. May 23, 1498, the Florentine sun ascends over the Piazza della Signoria, casting stark shadows across the ancient stones where a multitude has gathered. Not for worship do they come, but to witness the undoing of the man who once held sway over their very souls. The prophet faces his fiery end. The tyrant confronts the flames he himself unleashed upon countless works of art, cherished books, and nascent dreams. The crowd that once trembled at his pronouncements now hungers for the sound of his suffering. This is not merely the chronicle of an execution, it is the saga of how unchecked power corrupts absolutely, how fear can be weaponized to subjugate entire populations, and how those who wield the sword of religious extremism ultimately perish by it. Gerolamo Savonarola's rise and fall remains a haunting reminder that history's most perilous figures often cloak themselves in righteousness, uttering words that promise salvation, yet deliver only poison. Late 15th century Florence existed as a city caught in the precarious balance between two diverging realities. The Renaissance had elevated it to Europe's artistic and intellectual epicenter, a haven where the Medici family had nurtured an extraordinary surge of art, literature, and humanist philosophy. Lorenzo de' Medici, revered as Lorenzo the Magnificent, had transformed Florence into the envy of the known world. Within its walls, Michelangelo sculpted marble into the semblance of life. Botticelli captured the ethereal beauty of Venus rising from the waves, and scholars rediscovered the timeless wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. This was a time of unprecedented opulence and cultural flourishing, yet beneath the shimmering surface of this golden age, insidious currents were stirring. The Catholic Church was steeped in corruption, with Pope Alexander VI, the notorious Rodrigo Borgia, openly flaunting his mistresses and brazenly auctioning off ecclesiastical offices to the highest bidders. Many devout Christians felt a profound betrayal by the very institution entrusted with safeguarding their faith. While the common populace marveled at the artistic grandeur surrounding them, they often grappled with the harsh realities of poverty and disease. They yearned for spiritual leadership that resonated with authenticity, for a voice that would speak truth to power and purify the corruption that seemed to permeate every echelon of society. Into this volatile environment stepped Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose early life was characterized by disappointment and a sense of profound inadequacy. Born in Ferrara in 1452, he experienced the sting of rejection when his marriage proposal was denied by the family of the woman he loved, ultimately driving him into the embrace of the church. His initial forays into preaching proved disastrous. Contemporary observers depicted him as awkward and unpersuasive, his voice grating and off-putting, repelling congregations rather than attracting them. Yet these experiences of rejection and failure served to harden his resolve, forging a man of unwavering conviction who would brook no compromise with what he perceived as a world drowning in sin. The pivotal moment arrived in 1490 when Savonarola returned to Florence and began to preach at the convent of San Marco. A transformation had occurred within him during those years of struggle. His sermons, once faltering and ineffective, now blazed with apocalyptic fervor. He proclaimed to have received divine revelations foretelling impending punishment for Italy, asserting that the church's corruption and the vanity of Renaissance culture had incurred heaven's wrath. His voice, once weak, now resonated with thunderous force through the cathedral as he vividly depicted the torments awaiting the unrepentant. He spoke of rivers of blood, of foreign armies descending from the north, and of a divine reckoning that would separate the righteous from the damned. What amplified Savonarola's impact was not just the sheer intensity of his message, but its unsettling accuracy. In 1494, precisely as he had foretold, French armies under Charles VIII invaded Italy, sweeping aside all opposition. The Medici family, Florence's long-standing rulers, fled in disarray as their carefully constructed political edifice crumbled overnight. To the terrified denizens of Florence, it appeared that Savonarola's prophecies were unfolding with chilling precision. Here was a man who had accurately foreseen events that had eluded seasoned political analysts and military strategists. If he possessed the foresight to predict the invasion, what other divine secrets might he hold regarding God's plans for their city? The power vacuum left by the Medici's hasty departure was swiftly filled by Savonarola and his burgeoning legion of followers. What initially began as a religious revitalization soon metamorphosed into something far more ominous. A theocratic regime that would render the Spanish Inquisition comparatively mild. Savonarola proclaimed Christ himself as the new king of Florence, with the friar serving as his terrestrial emissary. This was no mere symbolic gesture. Savonarola wielded tangible political authority, advising the newly established Republican government and leveraging his influence to reshape every facet of Florentine society in accordance with his stringent interpretation of Christian doctrine. Under Savonarola's sway, Florence underwent a rapid and unnerving transformation. The city, once celebrated as Europe's cultural beacon, devolved into a surveillance state where informants lurked on every corner and citizens lived under the constant shadow of denunciation. Savonarola organized children into bands of zealous enforcers who patrolled the streets, forcibly entering homes in search of vanities. Anything deemed sinful or excessive cosmetics, jewelry, lavish clothing, secular literature, musical instruments, and works of art became targets for destruction. These juvenile zealots, some as young as 8, wielded the power to shatter lives with a mere accusation. The most infamous manifestation of this religious tyranny was the Bonfire of the Vanities, a series of massive public burnings held in the Piazza della Signoria. Citizens were compelled to surrender their possessions to be consumed by flames that dwarfed the surrounding structures. Priceless manuscripts, irreplaceable artworks, and centuries of accumulated cultural heritage went up in smoke while Savonarola's acolytes chanted hymns and praised God for the destruction. The very city that had birthed the Renaissance was systematically dismantling the cultural fabric that had defined its greatness. Botticelli himself, the celebrated painter of Venus, was reportedly swept up in the religious frenzy, casting some of his own creations into the inferno. However, it was not only material objects that were consumed in Savonarola's Florence. Human lives were also devoured by the flames of fanaticism. The friar's sermons became increasingly vitriolic, advocating for the torture and execution of sodomites, heretics, and anyone who dared to question his authority. He established a network of spies and informants, turning neighbor against neighbor and parent against child. Public floggings became commonplace, and the specter of execution loomed over anyone suspected of insufficient piety. The city's prostitutes were driven from their homes, its artists silenced, and its scholars forced to choose between exile and abject submission. The psychological toll on Florence's population was devastating. A culture that had championed human achievement and individual expression was replaced by one that demanded unwavering conformity and self-denial. Citizens walked the streets with averted gazes, fearful of displaying any sign of pleasure or prosperity that might be construed as sinful vanity. Laughter became suspect, beauty was equated with temptation, and learning was viewed with suspicion unless it served explicitly religious purposes. The vibrant spirit of the Renaissance that had made Florence the wonder of Europe was being systematically suffocated by a man claiming to speak on behalf of God. Yet, even as Savonarola tightened his grip on Florence, the seeds of his eventual downfall were being sown. His escalating power brought him into direct confrontation with Pope Alexander VI, who had initially been willing to tolerate the friar's reforms. However, Savonarola's relentless attacks on church corruption became increasingly personal and pointed with thinly veiled allusions to the Pope's own moral failings. When Savonarola openly declared that Alexander VI was not the true pope and called for a council to depose him, he crossed a line of no return. The Pope's response was swift and calculated. In May 1497, he issued a papal bull excommunicating Savonarola and placing Florence under interdict, a spiritual blockade that severed the city from the sacraments and jeopardized the salvation of every citizen. This was psychological warfare of the highest order, designed to incite the Florentines to turn against their self-proclaimed prophet. If Savonarola truly spoke for God, some wondered, why had God's representative on earth cast him out? These seeds of doubt, once planted, began to germinate with alarming speed. Savonarola's response to his excommunication revealed the full extent of his megalomaniacal delusions. Rather than seeking reconciliation or demonstrating humility, he proclaimed the Pope to be the Antichrist and declared his excommunication invalid. He continued to conduct Mass despite being forbidden and encouraged his followers to disregard the papal interdict. While this defiance might have appeared heroic to his most devoted adherents, to many Florentines, it resembled the ravings of a man consumed by pride and disconnected from reality. How could someone claiming to serve God so blatantly defy the head of the very church that Christ had established? As political and religious pressures mounted, Savonarola engaged in increasingly desperate measures to substantiate his divine authority. In April 1498, he consented to undergo a trial by ordeal, a test by fire that would supposedly demonstrate God's favor. Should he emerge from the flames unscathed, it would validate his divine mission. The entire city congregated in the Piazza della Signoria to witness this spectacle, but at the critical moment, Savonarola hesitated and ultimately refused to enter the fire. His followers offered excuses, claiming rain had dampened the wood and that the trial should be postponed, but the damage to his reputation was irreparable. The failed trial by fire marked the beginning of the end for Savonarola's theocracy. The man who had demanded unwavering faith from others had revealed that his own faith faltered when confronted with tangible danger. The crowd, anticipating a miracle, instead witnessed a coward who sent others to face perils he himself would not confront. Murmurs of discontent that had been circulating in private erupted into the open as Florentines began to question everything their prophet had proclaimed. Within days of the failed trial, public sentiment had decisively turned against Savonarola and his followers. Freed from fear by the friar's evident weakness, the citizens of Florence began to recall what they had forfeited during his reign of terror. They remembered the artworks destroyed, the books burned, and the friends and neighbors executed or exiled. The Renaissance culture that had once been their source of pride had been trampled underfoot by a man whose sole claim to authority was his ability to instill fear. On April 8, 1498, an enraged mob surrounded the convent of San Marco, where Savonarola had sought refuge. The building that had been the center of his power became his prison, as hundreds of citizens demanded his surrender. When his supporters attempted to defend the convent, street fighting erupted, but the friar's followers were vastly outnumbered, and after hours of intense conflict, the convent doors were breached. Savonarola was dragged from his cell by the same people who had once knelt before him in reverence. The man extracted from San Marco bore little resemblance to the commanding figure who had once dominated Florence from the pulpit. 4 years of absolute power had taken a visible toll, aging him prematurely. His face, once animated with righteous indignation, now reflected only fear and confusion as he was handed over to secular authorities. The prophet who had claimed to possess divine visions now appeared as nothing more than a terrified middle-aged man exposed as a fraud. But Florence was not content with mere imprisonment. The city that had endured Savonarola's tyranny demanded a full accounting of his transgressions, and they would extract that confession through methods that the friar himself might have condoned during his reign. The man who had condemned others to the torture chamber would now experience its horrors firsthand, learning that the techniques he had sanctioned for extracting truth from heretics were equally effective against those who claimed to speak for God. The torture commenced immediately following Savonarola's arrest, conducted in the basement of the Palazzo Vecchio under the supervision of both civil and ecclesiastical officials. The instrument of choice was the strappado, also known as the rack, a device refined during the Inquisition and considered the most efficient means of breaking even the strongest will. The prisoner's hands were bound behind his back and attached to a rope that passed over a pulley. He was then hoisted into the air by his arms, his entire body weight pulling against shoulder joints never designed to withstand such strain. The initial lifting was excruciating as the victim felt his shoulder joints begin to separate under the unnatural pressure, but the true horror unfolded when the torturer suddenly released the rope, allowing the prisoner to plummet several feet before being violently jerked to a halt. The sounds of popping bones and tearing ligaments resonated throughout the chamber. Each drop induced agonizing pain as the victim's shoulders gradually dislocated, while the sudden deceleration sent shockwaves of agony through every nerve ending. Contemporary accounts recount Savonarola's screams reverberating through the palace as the torture sessions persisted for hours, day after day. The man who had preached about the purifying nature of suffering was now experiencing firsthand the torment endured by his victims. His torturers, many of whom had lost loved ones to his reign of terror, displayed no compassion as they applied the techniques the friar had once championed. Between sessions on the rack, he was confined to a cell barely large enough to accommodate his prone form, where infection and fever from his injuries compounded his suffering. The psychological torture was perhaps even more devastating than the physical pain. Savonarola had predicated his entire identity on his claim to divine revelation, his absolute certainty that God communicated through him. But as the torture persisted and no divine intervention materialized to rescue him, that certainty began to erode. Where was the God who had supposedly chosen him as his prophet? Why were his pleas for deliverance unanswered? The silence from heaven was more crushing than any physical blow his torturers could inflict. After 2 weeks of systematic torture, Savonarola's body and spirit were shattered. His arms hung uselessly at his sides, dislocated and contorted into unnatural positions. His voice, once capable of commanding a city, was reduced to a hoarse whisper. Most devastatingly, his faith, the cornerstone upon which he had constructed his life, lay in ruins. The confession he ultimately signed acknowledged that his visions were fabrications, that his prophecies were the product of his own ambition rather than divine inspiration, and that he had misled Florence for his own aggrandizement. But even this abject confession failed to satiate the appetite for vengeance that had festered during Savonarola's reign. Florence had suffered too deeply under his tyranny to be satisfied with mere imprisonment or exile. The city demanded blood, and they would have it in the most public and degrading manner imaginable. Savonarola would meet his end where he had staged his bonfires, in the same square where he had presided over the destruction of so much beauty and culture. The flames that had devoured art and literature would now consume the man who had ignited them. The execution was scheduled for May 23, 1498, providing the city ample time to prepare a spectacle befitting the occasion. Carpenters erected a massive platform in the center of the Piazza della Signoria, elevated enough to be visible from every corner of the square. A gibbet was constructed for the hanging, while beneath it, laborers piled wood and kindling for a fire designed to burn with sufficient intensity to obliterate not only flesh and bone, but any trace of Girolamo Savonarola's existence. This would not be a swift demise, but a protracted agony intended to serve as entertainment for the masses and a stark warning to future would-be tyrants. As news of the execution rippled throughout Tuscany, people converged on Florence from hundreds of miles away. They arrived not out of sympathy for the condemned man, but out of morbid curiosity to witness the downfall of a figure who had wielded such formidable power. Merchants shuttered their shops, farmers abandoned their fields, and nobles deserted their palaces to witness the final act of the drama that had captivated all of Italy. By dawn on the day of execution, the Piazza della Signoria was teeming with humanity, a sea of faces united in their collective desire to witness justice exacted. The crowd's atmosphere was festive rather than somber, more akin to a carnival than a religious observance. Vendors hawked food and wine to the spectators, while pickpockets plied their trade within the dense throng, and prostitutes, the very women Savonarola had banished from the city, openly solicited in defiance of his memory. Children who had once served as his enforcers hurled stones and shouted insults at the platform where he was to die. The city that had trembled in fear for 4 years was finally celebrating its liberation, a celebration to be sanctified by the blood of the man who had stolen their joy. When the prison doors creaked open at dawn, the figure that emerged bore no resemblance to the commanding prophet who had once ruled Florence. Savonarola had to be carried, his tortured body incapable of supporting its own weight. His arms hung at unnatural angles, clearly fractured and poorly set. His face, once illuminated with divine fury, was now ashen and etched with pain and despair. Most striking was his silence. The man whose voice had once echoed across the city now seemed incapable of speech, whether due to physical damage to his throat or psychological collapse. The procession to the scaffold was deliberately slow, affording the crowd maximum opportunity to unleash their fury upon the man who had terrorized them for so long. Guards formed a protective barrier around the prisoner as citizens surged forward to spit upon him, strike him with sticks, and hurl the most depraved insults they could muster. Some threw rotting fruit and animal waste, while others simply screamed their hatred until their voices gave out. This was not the dignified procession of a martyr to his death, but the debasing parade of a tyrant facing the justice he had denied to others. Upon reaching the scaffold, Savonarola was stripped of his simple brown robe, leaving him naked before the crowd that had once worshipped him. This final humiliation was calculated to eradicate any vestige of dignity, to demonstrate to the thousands of onlookers that their former prophet was nothing more than frail flesh and fractured bone. The man who had sermonized against the evils of physical beauty and the necessity of modesty now stood exposed in his human vulnerability, a living testament to the mortality he had denied when claiming divine authority. The execution itself was designed to combine multiple forms of death in the most agonizing manner conceivable. Initially, Savonarola would be hanged by the neck, but not to the point of death, only until he lost consciousness and his body went limp. He would then be revived and hanged again. The process repeated until his tormentors deemed he had suffered sufficiently. Only then would the fire be kindled beneath him, ensuring he would be conscious to experience the full horror of being burned alive. This was not simply an execution, but an elaborate act of torture designed to appease the crowd's lust for revenge. As the noose was placed around Savonarola's neck, he attempted to speak, perhaps to utter a prayer, perhaps to proclaim his innocence one last time. But his voice was too feeble to penetrate the din of the crowd, and his words were lost in the cacophony of jeers and cheers that erupted as the executioner prepared to carry out his task. The man who had commanded silence with a mere gesture was now unable to make himself heard above the clamor of those he had once terrorized. Even his final moments were denied the dignity he had stripped from his own victims. And the first hanging was brief, just long enough to demonstrate the executioner's power over life and death. Savonarola's body convulsed at the end of the rope as his face turned purple and his eyes bulged from their sockets. The crowd cheered as he lost consciousness, but their celebration was premature. This was merely the prelude to his ordeal. Once he was lowered and revived, the process was repeated, each iteration eliciting new screams of agony from the condemned man and fresh roars of approval from the spectators. Following the third hanging, with Savonarola barely conscious and his body racked with convulsions, the torches were finally applied to the kindling beneath the scaffold. The flames ignited rapidly, fueled by the dry wood and pitch that had been meticulously prepared for maximum heat. As the fire ascended toward the platform, the crowd surged forward, eager to witness every detail of their former tyrant's final moments. This was the culmination of months of planning, the moment when Florence would be rid of the man who had held it captive in chains of fear and fanaticism. The aroma of burning wood was soon replaced by something far more macabre as the flames reached Savonarola's feet and began to consume his living flesh. His screams, faint as they were, could still be discerned above the crackling of the fire and the jubilant cries of the crowd. Those nearest the scaffold later recounted that he appeared to be attempting to pray, even as the flames engulfed him, his lips moving in what might have been fragments of the same psalms he had once used to terrorize others. But if God was listening to those final prayers, he chose not to intervene. The fire raged for hours, devouring not only Savonarola's body, but also the wooden platform and gibbet. The crowd remained steadfast, unwilling to depart until they were certain that nothing remained of the man who had tormented them. Children were hoisted onto their parents' shoulders to obtain a better vantage point, while women who had been compelled to burn their cosmetics and jewelry in his bonfires now watched with satisfaction as he experienced the same flames. Justice, they believed, had finally been served. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the authorities undertook one final measure to ensure that Savonarola could never return to haunt Florence. His ashes and any remaining bone fragments were meticulously collected and cast into the Arno River, the same waterway that had carried away the ashes from his bonfires of the Vanities. This was not merely the disposal of remains, but a calculated act of erasure intended to prevent his followers from acquiring relics that might be used to proclaim him a martyr. Even in death, the authorities feared his ability to inspire fanaticism. The crowd finally dispersed as twilight enveloped Florence, but the jubilation persisted in taverns and homes throughout the city. For the first time in years, citizens felt free to laugh, to sing, to express beauty without fear of reprisal. The psychological shackles that had constrained them for so long had been broken along with their tormentor's body. Artists emerged from seclusion to resume creating, scholars dared to peruse forbidden texts, and ordinary people permitted themselves to revel in the simple pleasures that make life worthwhile. However, the tale of Girolamo Savonarola's ascent and decline carries lessons that extend far beyond the confines of Renaissance Florence. His transformation from a disillusioned preacher to an absolute ruler illustrates how charismatic leaders can exploit fear and uncertainty to gain ascendancy over even the most sophisticated populations. The Florentines were not uneducated peasants, but cultivated citizens of Europe's most refined city, yet they relinquished their freedom to a man who promised them security and salvation in exchange for their submission. The speed with which Savonarola's theocracy took root should serve as a cautionary tale for any society that cherishes freedom and tolerance. Within months of gaining influence, he had transformed Florence from a hub of artistic innovation into a police state where children reported on their parents and neighbors lived in constant apprehension of denunciation. The institutions that had safeguarded Florentine liberty, the guilds, the republican government, the checks and balances designed to prevent any individual from accumulating excessive power, all proved inadequate when confronted by a leader claiming divine authority. Perhaps most chillingly, the populace swiftly adapted to their new reality. Under Savonarola's dominion, people who had lived their entire lives in relative freedom learned to accept surveillance, censorship, and the perpetual threat of violence as commonplace aspects of daily existence. They rationalized their suffering as serving a higher purpose, convinced that the destruction of their culture was a prerequisite for their spiritual salvation. This willing complicity in tyranny demonstrates how even well-intentioned individuals can be corrupted when they surrender their individual judgment to charismatic authority. The psychological strategies employed by Savonarola to maintain control, the creation of a climate of perpetual crisis, the demonization of external enemies, the demand for unwavering allegiance to his person rather than to principles or institutions, have been replicated by dictators throughout history, from the Spanish Inquisition to modern totalitarian regimes. The pattern remains remarkably consistent. Leaders who assert special insight into divine will or historical destiny employ that claim to justify the most extreme measures against their perceived adversaries. The role of children in Savonarola's regime offers another unsettling parallel to later totalitarian movements. By organizing young people into bands of enforcers and encouraging them to betray their own families, he undermined the fundamental bonds of trust that hold societies together. When children cannot trust their parents and parents live in fear of their children, the family unit, traditionally the strongest defense against state overreach, becomes an instrument of oppression rather than a source of protection. The destruction of art and culture during the bonfires of the Vanities represents more than mere religious fanaticism. It was a calculated assault on the human spirit itself. Throughout history, tyrants have recognized that beauty, creativity, and independent thought pose fundamental threats to their power. By annihilating the cultural achievements that instill pride in a civilization, authoritarian leaders isolate individuals from their past and make them more reliant on the promises of a future that only the leader can deliver. Yet Savonarola's ultimate fate also underscores the inherent instability of power, founded on fear and deception. His claims of divine authority could only be sustained as long as his followers genuinely believed in his privileged connection to God. When that belief faltered initially due to the Pope's excommunication and subsequently by his failure in the trial by fire, his entire edifice of control crumbled with remarkable rapidity. The very crowds who had venerated him turned against him with the fury of people who realized they had been deceived. The brutality of Savonarola's execution, while shocking to modern sensibilities, mirrored the medieval understanding of justice as a public spectacle designed to restore social equilibrium. The Florentines believed that his offenses against their city could only be rectified by his public suffering and degradation. From their perspective, the man who had terrorized them for years deserved to endure the same fear and agony he had inflicted on others. The elaborate nature of his torture and execution served as both retribution and deterrence. Modern readers may question whether such extreme vengeance was justifiable, irrespective of Savonarola's misdeeds. The torture that shattered his body and spirit, the deliberate prolongation of his agony during the execution, and the meticulously choreographed public humiliation all raise disquieting questions about the nature of justice and the appropriate boundaries of punishment. Yet it is crucial to acknowledge that the Florentines perceived themselves as victims of a tyrant who had stolen years from their lives and destroyed irreplaceable cultural treasures. In the immediate aftermath of Savonarola's death, Florence rebounded to its former glory with remarkable speed. Artists who had concealed their brushes during the theocratic years re-emerged to create some of the Renaissance's most iconic masterpieces. Scholars resumed their study of classical texts, merchants reopened their businesses, and the city's renowned festivals and celebrations returned to fill the streets with music and laughter. It was as if the city had awakened from a 4-year nightmare to discover that the world of beauty and learning they had lost could be reclaimed. Nevertheless, the scars of Savonarola's reign never fully healed. Families fractured by betrayals struggled to rebuild trust. Artists who had burned their own works in moments of religious fervor mourned their lost creations. The generation of children who had served as the friar's enforcers carried psychological wounds that would haunt them throughout their lives. Florence had learned that civilization, however advanced, remains fragile in the face of organized fanaticism. The broader ramifications of Savonarola's rise and fall continued to shape European history for centuries. His challenge to papal authority helped pave the way for the Protestant Reformation that would fracture Christianity just 2 decades later. His exploitation of popular religious fervor to seize political power provided a blueprint that would be emulated by later revolutionaries and demagogues. His destruction of art and learning illustrated how swiftly cultural achievements can be erased by those who view them as threats to their ideology. Perhaps most importantly, Savonarola's story serves as a timeless reminder that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. The Florentines who lived through his reign learned that liberty, once forfeited, is far more challenging to recover than it is to safeguard. They discovered that the very qualities that define a great society, its tolerance, its openness to new ideas, its willingness to trust in the inherent goodness of humanity, can also render it vulnerable to those who would exploit those qualities for their own nefarious purposes. The ashes of Girolamo Savonarola may have been scattered in the Arno River 5 centuries ago, but the lessons of his life and death remain relevant to every generation that values freedom over security, tolerance over dogma, and beauty over ideology. His story stands as both a warning and an inspiration, a warning of how rapidly civilization can descend into barbarity when good people permit fear to eclipse reason, and an inspiration to all who believe that tyranny, however formidable it may appear, cannot ultimately withstand the human yearning for truth, beauty, and freedom. Ultimately, Savonarola's enduring legacy is not the theocracy he established or the terror he inspired, but the Renaissance that flourished in the aftermath of his demise. The art he attempted to destroy was replaced by even greater masterpieces. The learning he sought to suppress became the foundation for centuries of human progress, and the spirit he endeavored to crush arose from the ashes of his execution to create a world more beautiful and more free than anything he could have conceived. That, perhaps, is the most fitting retribution for a man who believed that human nature was too corrupt to deserve joy, beauty, or the freedom to chart its own course. So, what can we take away from the tumultuous tale of Savonarola and Florence? It's a stark reminder that power, especially when fueled by fear and rigid ideology, can corrupt even the most seemingly righteous individuals and societies. But it's also a testament to the enduring human spirit, our capacity to reclaim beauty and freedom even after the darkest of times. Savonarola's story is a mirror reflecting the best and worst of humanity, urging us to stay vigilant, to question authority, and to always cherish the values that make life truly worth living. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What struck you most about Savonarola's story? Do you see any parallels to the world we live in today? Leave a comment below. I'm really interested in reading your interpretations and answering any questions you might have. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please consider subscribing. That way, you won't miss out on future explorations of fascinating figures and events that have shaped our world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.